Welcome to our little time on television called The Story Matters. It's a conversational time, but you are very quick to the draw, and I know you notice that there's only one chair. And how do you have a conversation with only one chair? You need two people at least. Well, this is a conversation with myself. Someone asked me, does anyone ever interview you? And I said, well, no, they never have. Well, you'll have to interview yourself. And so I've been working with this idea that I have stories, my story, your story. All of those stories are important. That's the great conviction that we have when we come to this time and this place to do these videos, that all of our stories are important. So today I'm going to do a little dialogue with myself and through the items and objects that have been important in my life. And so let us begin. I want to start back when I was a little under 3 until the time I was 5. That was back in the 30s, if you can count back that far. And I was living in Michigan, and my father worked with welfare. He was in charge of a warehouse, and we lived 2 houses down. And I remember that house very clearly. I see all of the lines as clearly as if it were a house that I live in right now. The difference is that it's all black and white except for one place, and that is this large table that we had in our house. It was a wooden table, solid, hard as a rock, and it was all marked up because people had really done everything and anything on that table. That's the center of our house. And so that I see in color. I see the activities that go around. I see my sisters doing that thing they called homework. You know, they were older than I was. My mother and father playing with my aunt and uncle cribbage, a little game, board game with matchsticks, and I could never figure that out. And I thought, well, that's part of the adult mysteries, and I don't need to figure it out. And my sisters would come and they would lay out their design for their dresses, and they would create and bring into being the dresses that they wore to school. And this was my favorite place. I could do a lot of things. I could, when nobody else was around, I could use my Lincoln logs. Do you have Lincoln logs? This is all that's left of them, I'm afraid. But I would build things, and I could build them at the end of the table, and my mother would let me get away with that. Or I would play with the blocks with the letters. I didn't know any words to speak of at that time. I hadn't been working at that or been taught with that. And so I loved the blocks, though, and they would be there. But the time that I liked the best, was on Friday. Because on Friday, that was bread day. My mother would get a pan, a special pan. It was high up on the shelf. She would bring it down, and she would knead this dough, and she'd fill in this whole wash pan because she baked all of the bread for the whole week on that day. So I would take my place at the table, which was, as a young kid, I was sent out into the outskirts of the table, way over in the corner. But I was so glad because it allowed me to look right straight down at the kitchen. And in the kitchen, Mother would take this dishpan. It was a dishpan. Nothing like greasy or messy ever got into this dishpan. It was a special pan. And she would put that on this table. She'd take these cloths, she'd wet them down, and then we would wait. we would wait. And slowly, the cloths began to rise up. They began to get bigger, and there was a bump. And then it began to look like an ice cream cone, not the big fat ice cream cone that you've already taken most of it away, but the ice cream when you just got to the cone, you're not ready to quite bite into the cone. And there would be this magic, this incredible magic that would take place. And I spent a good many Fridays simply being right in that space to watch the bread come to big being. It was a great place and a great time, and I've always been grateful for this, and it has helped shape my life around the importance of tables. I love tables. I love tables. I love people around tables. I love people who are around tables and they're drinking coffee or milk or whatever, and chewing on cookies and all this kind of good stuff, and they're laughing and they're telling stories. We told a lot of stories in our household when I was young, and it had a lot of laughter. We had a lot of tears as well. We had some sad times, some difficult times. But I think back, and this is the story that shaped my story, namely that it's important to gather in a community and to be around a table and to enjoy your time together. There's another story. This story is when we moved. We moved because my two older sisters refused to not graduate from the school where they had become students and where they were headed towards graduation. And we were moving to another town, a little town, a kind of much slower town. Maybe religious, but maybe too religious sometime, you know. A very strict town. That's its reputation. And they just hated to do that, and they made it very difficult for my father, but he had to move because that's what the conditions of life said. So we moved to Zealand. And in Zealand, I have no real strong, compelling memories. I have scattered memories. I have memories of one day when everybody got out and flew their kites, and my dad made a kite, a simple kite, out of all the material we had, and he sent this kite high and flying. It wasn't as high as some of the others, but I was so proud of him and so proud of us that we were part of that. This was during the war, first part of the Second World War, back in the 40s. And we had blackouts, and blackouts meant you had to have curtains pulled and drapes, and you had to turn out your lights, or if you had lights, they couldn't be seen outside. One of our neighbors was the blackout warden, and he took his job very seriously. And he looked for every little crack that would allow light to come, and we kids thought that was incredibly funny. We had a great night one time when a young couple got married, and they went cheverine. Now, if you're not from the Midwest, you might not know what that means, but it means you go and get a pan, and you get a spoon, and you go to their house, and as they're getting ready to go to bed that first night, there were no honeymoons in the middle of the Second World War. There was no money for that, no time for travel, no gas, no rationing for any of that kind of thing. And so they would go home, but all their neighbors would come just as their lights would go out in their bedroom. They would turn with all these pots and pans and bang and bang and bang and bang and shout and scream. And as a result, the couple was supposed to have candy ready, and they would get up out of bed and they would bring candy to the door and treat all the neighbors, and it was a great time. It was a great time. But my older sister, one older than me, there was three older than me, she remembers that experience differently. She remembers that the two of us, I was in kindergarten and first grade, were chased home very often by some really difficult teenagers. And she has a great deal of memory of pain for that. I seem to not have that quite as present, but I didn't really like living in Zealand. I didn't really like not being in our hometown. I didn't like that. And I was lonely and didn't have very many friends. So the one place that I really liked the best was you went up the stairs and you went up to the second floor. And as you're approaching there, the stairs turn around and go back this way. There was a platform, a pause, a break. And there were windows there, about 4 or 5 windows across, and you could see all the way out. And then there was a counter or a bed. It was a window box of some kind. And I would go up there, and I loved that place because I could actually go to sleep up there. And I would watch the storms, but basically, above all, I would watch for my father. I'd watch for my father to come home from Holland to Zealand. I could spot his car, sometimes, way off in the distance. And then I'd have to wait to see if I spotted it correctly, because the car would go behind a big furniture factory that was there. And when the car would turn, and it would come down, and then I would know that that was my father because I recognized the car. And I would then get out of my space, throw away my papers and my books that I were reading at the time, or I didn't read, but I was looking at the time, and I'd go find my father. And that was one of the best moments of the day, for me, when Dad came home. There's another time in my life when we moved back to Holland. We moved back to Holland. And when we did that, we moved into a house that was unbelievable. Unbelievable. There was a basketball hoop in the living room. Yes, a basketball hoop in the living room. There was clotheslines in the living room, so that laundry didn't have to go outside. It could be inside. Back in the far end of the house, there was a place where they used to keep chicken coops. Chickens were in that shed and right adjoining the house. Behind that, out in the backyard, there was a little goldfish pond that had been allowed to dry up and no longer had any goldfish. I would have liked to have seen it when it had goldfish. And then they used to bring horses in. You couldn't come into town with a horse, but you couldn't stay there, but they would bring horses in. And this family did all kinds of interesting things. They're very unusual. They had little carriages that they had built, very special, and they were tucked away up in the attic. We were not supposed to go on that side of the attic, but we did. And they used to have ice cream and cake for the kids on Friday night. And the young kids in the neighborhood, they would just come in the door, because that's what the ground rules had been before. Well, that worked one time with my mother, one time per child. Very kindly, but very firmly, she made it clear that they needed to knock on the door and ask if anybody was there and if they could come in. Well, we lived in that house, and we adjusted to it, and there was a lot of fun things. But school was a tough tough time. I didn't get what it meant to listen to sounds. They were moving to sight spelling and not away from phonetics. I didn't know what phonetics were in those days or what was going on, but I know it was hard. And I didn't really do well in the mathematics as well. And so I had a tough time in school. And at first I tried to hide that. Then I tried to pretend that it wasn't there. Then I finally, and I had a difficult time because my third grade teacher was sick and we had one substitute after another, so no one really knew my name or who I was and what the problems were. Until I got to third grade. In third grade, I had as a teacher Miss Whitmer, who is supposedly the toughest teacher in the whole school. And she really was very demanding, but she worked with my mother. And my mother made up tables for knowing your multiplication tables. Yes, they still did that in those days. Knowing your multiplication tables, and we drilled on those time and time again, and she would give me words. And when we came to the end of the school year, I came home from school, and my mother said, "You look so sad and unhappy. What's wrong? Didn't you get promoted?" And I said, "Yes, I got promoted, but God must not like me at all because so did Miss Whitmer, and she's going to be my teacher next year as well." I thought that was such a terrible thing, but in truth it became the best thing that could have happened to me, because I had another year with Miss Whitmer and with my mother, and the two of them, I think, really rescued me. I have no idea where I would be if I hadn't had that attention and that care and that kindness. Years later, I was speaking in the church, and Miss Whitmer came because her cousins belonged to that congregation. And I told the story of Miss Whitmer and my experiences, and I made her cry. I didn't really mean to make her cry, but it made me cry too. But I made her cry with such joy, and the two of us became good friends. Still teacher, student, but good friends. And I will always be grateful for the determination that I learned from working with those two people in terms of trying to overcome the obstacles and the issues before us. Now, I want to shift this a little bit and say that when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, I was going to get a job. I was going to get a job because everyone in my family, every man in my family went and got jobs. That's what you did. You went and got jobs, and you supported yourself, paid the bills, raised your children, took care of the food, whatever entertainment you could have, what kind of car you could get, and all of those things were part of having a job and going to work. I was dating a young girl named Lou, so Len and Lou, because we got teased about that a bit. And her brother was my best friend, and her father taught at the local college. And he started having conversations with me. Now, I liked him a lot, so I wasn't afraid of him. But he had conversations, and he was persistent. And he said to me, "Why aren't you going to college?" I said, "Well, nobody in our family has gone to college." He said, "You ought to go to college." And so we had a number of those conversations, and 3 months before the college was to start, he came home and he had all the paperwork and he'd filled out a good share of it. And he said, now you finish this up and take it to this man in this office. And all of a sudden, I became a college student. And I'll always be grateful. I always had to start with that same kind of place where I'm not sure quite where we are and what's happening, but you got to hang on with persistence. And with persistence, you need to, you can grow, and persistence you can develop. And I looked at my report cards a couple of years ago, and yes, my grades went up as the time went on because of the lessons in persistence that I was taught. So those are the stories that helped to shape my story, namely to gather around the table, to be in the company of people who cared for me and who listened to me and who allowed us to be funny and to be serious and to be wacky and all kinds of things. And to know that there's someone that is ready to be with you when things are not going so well, when you feel lonely and to feel cut off and separated, and that there can be people who will give you support. And knowing that you can learn, that you can learn because others help you and help create a framework for this, but you take your own curiosity and you learn in this whole process. And as I look back on my life, those are a key part of my experience in terms of shaping my story. I want to end with one thing. This is a gift that was given to me not too long ago by a friend. And he was a man that had coffee with me. And we would talk, and we had a good time with each other. His house was filled with creative things, junk that he had picked up in the yard or on the parking lot. And he did this creative art, and art came out of this stuff. And he had one day a piece of track, of the HO gauge track. And he had it in his hand, and he went like this. I wanted to get one, but it seems that mine is gone a long time ago, and everybody else who has HO track, has it put away someplace, and I couldn't find one. So in your imagination, see this piece of track, small piece of track, straight piece of track, goes like this with his hand, and he would pound, just kind of pushed it back and forth. And we ended up then telling train stories. And I thought, what is he doing with this? And then about 3 weeks later, we had coffee again, and he had that same piece of track in his hand, and he went like this and like this. And then I thought, oh, he's trying to find out. He's trying to find out if I'm really serious about this, if I really believe that there's something to be gained from knowing where you're going and what you're doing and how you're going to get there. Not just the train from the time when I had it as a child, but in terms of their whole life. And so when it was time for me to leave this town, he showed up and gave me this. Now, I noticed Chris never put that straight piece of track into this piece of sculpture. It's not there at all. And I thought, oh, he's a smart guy. He's a smart guy. Life isn't like a straight track all the time. So we have instead a track that comes like this, And then one track goes off this way and one track goes off this way. So what is it that will allow you to go from the right track? You need to make decisions about how you're going to be shifting from here to there, and whether you're going to make that move or whether you're going to continue to move right ahead. And then you'll notice also we have things that come across our life that it just seem to come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're there, and we've got to learn how to respond to them as well. And so here in this piece, and he calls it transition. And that's the reality of life. We're doing transition almost all the time. So I want to thank you for letting me share with you this time. I want to thank you and encourage you to think about your story, and maybe go back and look at the places that helped to shape that story, and why that story is yours, why it's really important, and what can you learn, and what can you do, and how do you hang on to this whole way of knowing your identity and knowing who you are. So blessings upon you as we share our stories and find them. And may it be good for you this day and always.